Welcome back to the Crystal Communications After Dark Lecture Series. I'm your host, Amaranth Lowry. I'm pleased to introduce our special guest, folklorist Dr. Hermia Lloyd of the University of Jumar School of Spellshaping. Dr. Lloyd, welcome.
Pleasure to be here.
Dr. Lloyd has published a variety of works on folkloric subjects, ranging from research on old Voxian traditions to translations of archaic Saliana lore. Her most recent work, Beings of Power, Beings of Hardships, is a historical survey of arcanical folkloric tropes. Perhaps despite your body of work, Dr. Lloyd, I'm sure a lot of our listeners are no doubt wondering why we've invited you onto the Crystal Communications spot.
An understandable concern. I imagine many of them are wondering, why bring in a folklorist with the Meridian market bottoming, Blacksail's piracy at an all-time high, and, Vox going to hell and then some.
Well, at the very least, Vox is stabilizing a bit.
Indeed, it does seem like the combination of this allied Meridian presence and the Black Barrow's resistance, whatever that actually is, has really slowed the crawl of the so-called faithless and their specialty troops.
Though piracy is an aggravated problem now.
And not just in Vox. I hear Jumar's finally been hit with the piracy problem too. Oh, what's that old saying? When times get dark, get ready for the black mark.
Something like that.
Yes, Anyways, folklore. Well, it's funny. I was remarking to a colleague the other day that it seems like anywhere and everywhere you look, things are bad. This colleague of mine responded to me, "Well, Hermia, you're not wrong. Things are bad." These hard times upon us, however, really lead directly to the work I do, which is cross-comparative literary analysis of folkloric figures in conflict period myths, which is what I write about in Beings of Power, Beings of Hardship.
Could you take a moment to give us a short summary of the book?
Of course. In my book, I'm arguing what's honestly a very simple point. During times of struggle and conflict, people create folkloric tropes to reassert control over their understanding of their day-to-day lives. What's interesting to me is that with these tropes, near universally, the folkloric figures are arcanical in nature, or as our international listeners might say, magical. People rely on fictitious accounts of powerful arcanical beings to communicate larger themes about their existence. These arcanical tropes fill a void in our personal narrative. Firstly, these tropes demonstrate people's need for arcanical patterning in day-to-day life. Secondly, and I think more importantly, these tropes suggest that people, as storytellers, like to control their own narrative destinies.
Destinies. Sounds romantic.
I'm a slave to my work, and the old stories are generally quite romantic.
Could you give us an example of one of these tropes?
Yes, of course. I'll give the one that I find highly pertinent to the current international context. One of my chapters is on a figure called the Reaper. The Reaper myth originates, as many of my listeners probably know, in Vox, sometime during the 3 Years' War, which is roughly 500 years ago. The Reaper was a figure, always described as robed in black, that was believed to appear on battlefields during and after times of slaughter. Again, this figure originated during a time of massive, massive, massive violence. In songs and stories, this Reaper becomes a symbolic reference to the devastation of the age. As time goes on in Voxian history, the Reaper, who's generally gendered as a woman, becomes associated with times of famine, disease, drought, the list goes on.
And the Reaper is an international figure?
Yeah. Although the myth varies from place to place across the known world, we find stories of Reaper-like figures connected to periods of massive devastation. For instance, in Saliana, during the Great Drought, La Dame Noire becomes a popular folk heroine. La Dame Noire is this woman who appears before a massive die-off happens, and she's generally described as wearing long black veils, a black gown, a lot like the Reaper figure from Vox. In Meridian, similarly, there are a lot of older urban legends about the Lady Death. Historically, Lady Death is a fancily dressed woman who appears during times of mass disease, like I think one of the earlier references to her is the pox cough plague of about 200 or so years ago. I could go on with these examples. You really do see this Reaper figure, though she appears earliest in Boxian records, across the known nations.
Interesting. So, universally, we see a woman figure who is A, arcanically powerful, and B, oversees periods of mass death.
Yes, more or less. The general mythical assumptions about her is that she is either a harbinger of death or, in some cases, actually shepherding along the souls of the dead to some conception of the afterlife. Because of recent international events and the rising death count in Vox especially, this old folk legend has really gained some significant currency.
So, here's a question you must get asked a lot.
I bet I can guess it.
You probably can. If these figures exist in stories internationally, what's to say they're not real? I mean, why do you define them as stories?
Well, I'm going to be obnoxious and deviate from that question a little bit. But let me be clear here. What does it mean to be real? Why is a story unreal and a flesh and blood person real? My big argument throughout this entire book, and honestly, argument at the core of this book, is that we use stories to shape our own reality. The tropes and fictions we employ are products of the world we want to create. When we tell a story, we're carving out a corner of the universe that is uniquely ours. The question then isn't whether or not these figures actually exist. The question instead is what type of story have we been telling ourselves, and what types of stories are there still to be told?
Thank you, Dr. Lloyd. Again, for our listeners on the Crystal Communications Network, Dr. Hermia Lloyd's book is Beings of Power, Beings of Hardships, now available internationally through the University of Jumar Press booksellers.